Welcome back, Richard. It's good to see you, and happy Easter to you, my friend.
Good morning. You can tell I've got a different background today, right?
I can see that.
Which means I must be in a different place.
That is usually what that means. Yes.
Okay, so I'm in a new place, and everybody here is still sleeping. So bear with me.
Yes. We'll hope that we don't wake anyone and suddenly have dogs barking and people walking through,
and wives and daughters barking.
Yes.
Because I woke them up. But the topic is worth it, so we're going to do this because this is a topic worth pursuing. So here we go.
Absolutely. So we're gonna. It's sort of an extension of some of the things that we've talked about recently, and that is we're going to talk about the significant increase that we have seen over the past decade or two, really.
That's right. In the past couple of years, there's been this flurry of articles about mental health of children and teenagers. The rapid increase in mental health problems in young teens and older teenagers, and even young adults. So there's this span, and every once in a while, you open up a website, you keep seeing this same information. And we had done a podcast last week on the increases in teen suicide rates. Right. And I thought, and here we go again. There's this article about mental health issues in teenagers and young adults. So I thought, let me take a closer look at this and see what's going on.
Right. Yeah. So there's a couple of articles in the show notes that we mentioned and that we're going to talk about today. One is from the American Journal of Managed Care that really highlights one of the main articles that really highlighted this issue, and that's from the American Psychological Association, where they conducted this study between 2009 and 2019, and they were looking at the significant increase in depression and anxiety and some of these different affective or internalizing conditions in adolescents today.
Right. Yeah, that's what produced all these articles, is that the APA did a study of that 10-year period, roughly 2009 to 2019. And one of the conclusions of that study was that the cultural trends, whatever was going on in the culture during that decade, and we're roughly talking about 2010 on, whatever was going on seemed to have a differential effect on adolescents and young adults than it did on anybody else. The interesting part of the study is it was a lifespan study. And over again, you found the same thing, that it seemed to have a differential effect on teenagers and young adults, but no effect on whatever was going on in the culture. Didn't affect Americans really over the age of 25, and certainly not over the age of 65.
Absolutely. So just thinking about some of those statistics. Okay. Right. So and so when we have to think about this. So when they're collecting data from 2009 until 2019 or so, what they're really collecting, they're not collecting data from actually those dates, right? So they're really looking at information from 2008 to about 2017 or so. So if we're looking at that span of time, there was a 71% increase in serious psychological distress in individuals between the ages of 18 and 25. And for depression specifically, there was a 52% increase. So that's again, like you said, that's a tremendous increase in these symptoms in that particular population, in people within those 7 years of age, a massive increase. There was also a 78% increase in serious psychological distress in those between 20 and 21 with depression at 63%. So again, even narrowing it even more, we can see even a more significant risk or significant increase in distress. Right.
And yet, as we said, those rates actually declined in older adults. Right. So it wasn't something that was affecting everybody. We think of the pandemic, but the pandemic affects all age groups. Okay.
Right.
But there's something going on that seems to be affecting people between the ages of 13 and 21, because even the rates of depression remain stable in those 26 and older. And
Right.
so whatever was affecting the teenagers wasn't affecting even young adult 26-year-olds and up. Okay. And we did that podcast last week that had similar data,
Right.
that from 2010 to 2020, roughly the same period, that suicide death rates increased by 50% in that 13 to 8-year group. Okay. And so we see this same thing by 2014. So that would be about the middle of this study. Suicide had become the second leading cause of death in 10 to 14-year-olds, and the leading cause of death in 10 to 17-year-olds. These are data from Utah, but it seems like it's happening across states. This same age range seems to be differentially affected by whatever is going on around them.
Right. And so no matter what the statistics are, whether we're looking at Utah, whether we're looking at the APA data from nationwide, whatever data that we're looking at, it's not looking great for this group of individuals.
That's right.
Between the ages of about 13 to the mid 20s. And
right.
So, we looked at this, looking into this a little bit more, found this article from The Atlantic, and it's another article that's linked in the show notes. And, they kind of pulled together this idea of why teenagers are so sad these days. What's contributing to this? And this really is the crux of what we're going to talk about today.
Right. Yeah, The Atlantic is really doing some good work, and Derek Thompson is one of their staff writers, and he does very thorough research, and he has this wonderful way of taking complex ideas and distilling them into meaningful information. And when we get to the end of this podcast, he's going to talk about what these effects have been attributed to. And so I think he's done a masterful job. And his article, again, begins with these troubling data. He uses data from a CDC study. So we've seen an APA study for these years. Now there's a CDC study. And the CDC study looked at what researchers call persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness is what they were looking for. And these are studies that are done almost yearly by CDC. And so they're tracking feelings of sadness and hopelessness. And they report an increase from 26% to 44% of American high school students who feel sad and depressed and hopeless. They've never reached 44% in the past. Okay, this is the highest increase that's ever been recorded.
Right. And again, this is in the same time period. The CDC was talking about from 2009 until 2021. So again, roughly this same decade, this past decade of the what we call it, the teens. So yeah, again, whether you're looking at the APA data, the data from Utah, or the CDC, we're seeing everyone is reporting this similar significant increase in depressive-like or psychological distress in this age group.
That's right, and we see it across issues. We talk about feelings of sadness and hopelessness, but we remember from last week's podcast that suicide attempts and deaths from suicide are also increasing significantly in these populations. So the big picture here, what he's telling us is that almost every measure of mental health status is getting worse. It doesn't matter what you look at. It can be sadness, hopelessness, it can be suicide attempts, suicide completions. Regardless of what you look at, every measure is getting worse. And it's for every teenage demographic. It's across races, it's across cultures, it's across states. It's happening. We mentioned Utah before, that suicide is the leading cause of death up to age 17. It's happening across states. So it's a widespread, almost ubiquitous problem. Right. And so there seems to be this pervasive feeling of sadness and hopelessness in young people that's leading them to make these life-changing decisions.
Right. And so as we think about why this is happening, you know, that's always the goal of some of this research, is to figure out, okay, so we see these data, and we can analyze it and we can talk about it, but we really want to figure out why it's happening. And I think that we need to kind of start out with kind of dispelling some fallacies, because we're very tempted to you know, pick that low hanging fruit of, well, you know, it's just teens being bad, you know, it's just, they're just complaining.
Whining and complaining.
Yeah. And, you know, so that's probably all that it is.
Right.
Well, it's probably not. There's other data to suggest that it's not that.
Right. That's right. Because a lot of the other, what we consider bad behaviors, are not changing. Drinking and driving down 50%, fights in school down 50%, sex in young teenagers down 70%. LGBTQ acceptance is up, though they have this group has so many struggles. The acceptance among their peers is up. Okay, so that it doesn't look like this is just teenagers being teenagers.
Right. And the other related to that is that, you know, well, one of the explanations that's often thrown out there is that, well, you know, teenagers have always been moody. You know, so they've always kind of had some of these issues. But again, if that was the case, then why would the data change so significantly? If teenagers have always been moody and have always, you know, if this is the same thing that's always been going on with teenagers, why would this increase be so significant?
Right. And so when we talk about hopelessness and sadness, that's a subjective measure. You know, they're looking at a box and they check 1, 2, 3, or 4.
Told you.
People are getting up. But also what Thompson points out is the objective measures are increasing. So there's been an increase in eating disorders. There's been an increase in self-harming behavior. And these are not subjective opinions. These are hospital data, teen suicides. All of the objective measures that something is dreadfully wrong are also up. So it's not just a new crop of teenagers. You know, we talk about the millennials and disease and the X's. It doesn't seem to be that, because even the objective measures are up.
Absolutely. And I guess that the other, you know, very tempting low-hanging fruit is to blame it on COVID. But again, you know, as we've talked about with the data, these data started in, you know, in the very least, we were looking at since 2010, where the rates have started to increase. And so we're not just talking about these last couple of years. And in fact, you know, the data from the APA ended before, you know, they ended before COVID even started. So, so it can't be just attributed to that.
Yeah, one of the things we talked about last week was we're looking at this 20-year period from 2000 to 2020, roughly, but certainly from 2010 to 2020. So all of these data were collected prior to COVID. Right? So it's not COVID. So it's not COVID. It's not whining, and it's not just this group is weak and is just always whining. So then he goes into the forces that seem to be propelling the increases. Okay, so he then talks about, and this is where Thompson is good, because what I like about his writing is that he takes these complicated issues and he has this very neat delineation of what seem to be the real factors behind the increases. And the first, of course, has to be
social media, and we've talked about that before, because we've praised the work of Jean Twenge, who wrote iGen. And she talks about the significant spike in teen sadness and anxiety that has occurred since 2012, which is of course when, you know, a lot of the cell phone and social media platforms really came to the forefront. And so, you know, it's again right around the time that we started seeing this significant increase in those same symptoms in the youth.
That's right. And I like the way he treats social media, because what he says, what everybody says, Gene Twing and studies, there was a meta-analysis of 226 studies. That's an enormous undertaking to look at the effects in 226 studies. No matter how you look at these data, something happened around 2012 or 2013, because while the data began increasing in 2020, it spiked at around 2012 or 2013.
It started to increase in 2010.
2010, but I mean, the data go back to 2000, okay,
right.
2001. But you see this rapid increase beginning around 2010, then you see the spike. Okay, so how do you explain the spike? Well, that's when the cell phone was introduced, and that's when social media. Okay, so that there seems to be some correlation between mental illness, sadness, hopelessness, and something about social media. But in all the studies that have been done, the effect seems to be very small. Actually, if you look at it carefully, yeah, there's some correlation, there's some relationship, but it's not having that much of an effect. And then I love what he says here. Social media is not like rat poison. Rat poison kills everything. Okay. He said social media is more like marijuana and alcohol. It's not a problem for most people. You've said many times, a lot of boys play violent video games. Very few of them become school shooters.
Right.
Okay, you've said that over the years. So like marijuana and alcohol, it's not a problem for most, but for some, it's the entrance to abuse. So social media, and I think that's a very good way to think about the effects of social media.
Right.
For most kids, it's not going to be a problem. Yes, it's irritating. We don't like to see it, but it's really not going to be a serious problem.
Yeah. There was a study in 2020 about Instagram.
Instagram did it, right?
And a third of girls report that Instagram made their life worse.
Not 3 out of 3, right?
Right, not every girl, but a third of girls. And okay, so if we look at those statistics a little bit, that's 33%. What did we say was the significant increase? It was approaching 30 and 40% of kids. Right. So a third of girls report that it makes their life worse. But what's fascinating is that even though it makes their life worse, they say that they can't stop using it.
Right. And that's what does that sound like?
Right. It sounds like an addiction.
Right.
And so we have to, but we've kind of talked about that a lot on the podcast on how we kind of jump to that word of addiction pretty easily. And we can talk more about that maybe in another podcast again, just to kind of review our perspectives of that. But the point is that whether it's because it's an addiction or because they are afraid of their lives passing without knowing what all's going on with their peers, they can't separate themselves from these media, even though it's making their life worse. They feel like it's making their life worse.
That's right. And these data about girls was backed up by a study in England. So again, even across countries. Cambridge University did a study, 84,000 teenagers, okay? Social media is associated with worse mental health in girls, ages 11 to 13. Why girls? Because teenage girls are uniquely sensitive to the kind of judgments that you see on social media, okay? And social media can capture this subset of girls, probably about 30 or 35%. It's not going to capture all of them, but it will capture a subset.
And I think that we have to, there are some other factors that we have to think into that as well. Sure, yes, girls are highly affected and very sensitive to the judgment of others, but maybe boys are too, but boys aren't as likely to admit it. They aren't as likely to answer questions, because all of these are survey data. And so it's influenced and they can only report what was reported to them in survey data. And so if you ask a boy, hey, how much are you affected by Instagram? Well, it may be the case that a lot of boys are going to say, oh, not at all. regardless of what really is happening, because, it's socially accepted that boys, as we just said, girls are uniquely sensitive to these things, implies that boys aren't.
Right.
So, yeah.
But if you think back to the 70s and 80s, in those years, we had girls' magazines.
Right.
You didn't have boys' magazines.
Right.
You had girls' magazines because they were the market. That's what they were marketed to.
Because girls read and boys don't.
Right. That's right. Boys play and girls read. Right.
Yep.
So we know that girls are, sadly, girls are differentially affected and just as they were differentially affected by magazines, Teen Vogue and all those magazines that came out. Now it's social media playing the same role. Okay. The other problem with social media is that not only fuels anxiety, but it makes it harder to cope with it because there's no relief from social media. It is there. I mean, if girls in the 80s read teen magazines, again, it was about makeup and clothes and diets and, they got a break from it. They would go to school and the magazines would stay at home. Today, there's no relief. You're never safe. You constantly worry about what's going on around you. It's a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week ordeal for these girls. There's this constant pressure. They're being bombarded by Discord, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, and it never ends. So you never get a break from it. Okay. So if you're prone to getting completely absorbed, it's easier to do because it's there 24 hours a day. Right.
And all of this sort of leads to his second point, and that is the significant decrease that we've seen in sociality overall. And what we mean by sociality, or what he means by sociality, is just true interactions. Right. Being out, being out and interacting with other people. Because if you're on social media, there are lots of other things that you're not doing. And that's what we've always talked about. When we talk to parents about how much screen time should a kid have, or how much time should they be allowed to play video games or on their phone, it's not so much that the video games or the technology that's the problem. It's what the technology is replacing that's the problem. That's right. I think that's a far bigger problem than, he says social media, it affects a percentage of kids, not all kids. Right. But the other thing is, it's what social media replaces. Right. And that might be a larger problem. Absolutely. So, we know that it significantly influences amount of time that kids sleep. That's right. And we know that when we don't sleep, we become more irritable. We become more prone to depression and anxiety and some of those kinds of things. Right. But there's a significant decrease in, hours of sleep that teenagers are receiving. But we also see this significant replacement of real friends with online friends. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. How many patients or kids do you talk to, Richard, that they're talking about a friend that it seems like it's somebody that lives in their neighborhood, but the friend lives in Japan. Right, another country. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, I can't go to sleep. I can't go to bed then, because that's when he gets off school, because he lives in Japan. Mm-hmm. And so I want to be up so that we can play the game together. And so we're sacrificing sleep. We're not interacting face to face with a real person. We're just in these virtual worlds all the time. Right. Jean Twenge pointed out that fewer kids are getting their driver's licenses. Right. 2 generations ago, your 16th birthday was that was one of the most, 16 and 21 were the 2 significant birthdays, because you got to drive. Kids don't need to drive anymore because their lives are not occurring outside of where they are. Our lives, our social lives, occurred outside of our homes when we were 16. Today, kids' social lives are in their hands. They don't need to drive. Yeah. Fewer are playing sports. There are fewer kids signing up for sports and other activities, not just sports, but all other activities. And as it turns out, we know that social isolation is worse for teenagers than it is for adults. Adults have learned how to handle being alone. Kids can't. Kids want to be around their peers, either real peers or virtual peers. Absolutely.
So isolation seems to have a worse effect on teenagers than it does on adults.
Absolutely. And with all this technology, and all this time on a screen, on social media, on some of these different things, comes, we get to his third point, which is, and again, this is something that we've talked about many times on the podcast, and that is just the access to information.
Right.
The world is more stressful now. I remember growing up, and there would be things going on in the world, and I just had no idea,
Blissfully unaware.
Because unless you sit down, and man, I hate saying these kind of things because these are the things that you say that make me tease you about being so old. But
you're doing your darndest to get there, Bernie.
But if you didn't watch the news at 6 o'clock in the evening, you didn't know what was going on.
Exactly.
There were 3 channels that had the news, and if you watched the news, then you knew what was happening, or if you read the newspaper, you knew what was happening. But it had to be a physical newspaper. It wasn't reading it online or anything.
Right.
And that was just how you got information about what was happening in the world. Now, kids come in. We have kids that come into sessions, and they're talking about things that are happening in the Ukraine and things that are happening in Russia and all over the world. And it's not for a school activity that they're learning. They're just learning it and picking it up from social media and from other technological sources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. And the sad part is that negative news gets more attention.
Absolutely.
So if you're in the news business, you're going to feed the audience what the audience wants. And so we often hear about these feel-good news stories. That doesn't sell news. That doesn't get advertisers. What gets advertisers is controversy, anger, negativity, and that's what we're seeing. And once again, we say the same thing here. You were bringing up a time when, if you didn't see the news, and it was usually on around 6 o'clock. Right. Okay, so you dinner hour, then 6 o'clock. It was on for a half hour, 6 to 6:30. They were all on at the same time. If you missed it, you couldn't get it again until the next night at 6 o'clock. Okay. Right. Then we started to have morning programs, early morning programs like the Today Show. But again, if you missed it, then you couldn't get it again until the next broadcast cycle. There was nothing going on during the day. They didn't have, now it's 24 hours a day, constant. You get it on your phone, you get it on your computer, you get it on your iPad, and there's no break.
Right.
We talked about not getting a break with social media. If you had a magazine, you left it at home. If you had a TV, the TV stayed at home. Now it's with you 24 hours a day, and their brains aren't getting a rest. You don't get a respite from all this stuff. And it's just like you're bombarded by it. So for teenagers who don't yet have the ability to sort everything out, the world does look like a more stressful and dangerous place than it ever has been.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Another point that he brings out and that he mentions comes up to parenting practices, parenting strategies. And we have absolutely seen a tremendous increase in, just a couple of decades ago, there were 3 parenting styles. And now there are books full of parenting styles that we can talk about. But some of the big things that are really coming out with, in parenting styles, and is really just pushed is this idea that parents have to keep their kids' schedules completely full all the time.
Right.
And they just keep, because they need to prepare for college, or they need to prepare for these next things in life. And so if they want to be successful in college, they have to be able to play the piano, and they have to be able to speak 3 languages, and they have to do this, and they have to do that, and they have to make all A's. And so parents push and push and push. So kids are, they're playing soccer 2 nights a week. They are taking piano once a week. They're doing tutoring 3 nights a week. And now suddenly the kid is going and expected to perform at a high rate, a high level, every day.
Right. That's right.
And
And I love that he took this on, and I love the way he dealt with it.
Yes.
He talks about modern parenting strategies, and he uses the term rugrat race, rugrat being a kid. And it is the rat race for youngsters. And it starts very early. Kids are starting at 3 and 4 years old with these huge schedules designed to prepare them in every way so that they have a resume that will get them into the elite colleges. And today, elite colleges are not just the Ivy League, they're most state schools as well. For example, in Florida, the University of Florida, the flagship university here, is almost has the status of an Ivy League school. You need to have all these credentials to get in. But in addition to overscheduling children, the other term he uses is this business of accommodation. And I think that's the larger, it's not just the rat race the kids are on. It's that parents are willing to accommodate to their kids' preferences. If you don't like broccoli, you don't have to eat it. If you don't want to do this, you don't have to do it. If you might need more help, you might need more time, you might need a trigger. What that does is if you're always accommodating to your kids' preferences, you're denying them the opportunity to develop resilience and strength and internal fortitude, because they don't ever have to face anything that they don't like.
Right. And I love the idea of what all of this does is it makes kids, even though parents are pushing, and we think about, we've talked before about how, in academics, we are pushing kids to where kindergartners are doing what second graders used to do. And, you have sixth graders taking, high school classes and everything.
Right.
So while we're pushing in some of these areas to excel, kids are growing up slower because they don't have the opportunities to experience some of these things. I mean, you talked about getting a driver's license a few minutes ago. Learning to drive is a really critical and important way to learn competence, to learn how your behavior influences and affects other people. And it teaches you some really important social, not to mention visual, spatial, and all those kinds of coordinations and things like that. But it teaches some of those really important competencies, and kids aren't doing it. Parents aren't requiring their kids to do those things anymore.
It's almost like a little Christmas tree or an Easter egg tree, where you're decorating your child with tennis lessons and music and languages and merit badges, and you're hanging all this tinsel on them, but yet there's no internal strength. Kids don't have any internal strength. They're not resilient, they're not strong, they're not internally motivated. It looks nice, they have a 4.5 grade point average, but there's nothing inside. And eventually that's going to catch up with them, and they're not going to have what they need. Yes, they've been accommodated, they've been nurtured, they've been trained, they've been coached, they've been tutored, but they've never developed anything on their own.
Right. Absolutely.
We have to remember James Madison was 23 when he was the ambassador to England.
Right.
We have all kinds of things that we can talk about with that, but they are growing up more slowly.
Right.
And there's a program at Yale called SPACE, SPACE, Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. And essentially what it does is it teaches parents to be less accommodating.
Yeah.
So it teaches parents how to expose their children to things they don't like, so that they learn how to manage stress. There was an article published a couple of weeks ago, and the author was advocating, do something you hate every day. Right. And he began by saying, with a cold shower. He said, it just teaches you that you can survive, that you can feel discomfort and survive. So he said he takes when he's done showering everything, he stands in this ice cold water for a few minutes just to teach himself that he can tolerate stress.
Yeah.
Okay? So, but we deny kids the opportunity to tolerate stress. We remember that one thing about the dad. His daughter came up, and my coach isn't giving me enough playing time. Dad said, work harder.
Yeah, absolutely. And that again transitions nicely to some of the other possibilities that he mentions, because I think that we've seen an increase in things like substance use and stuff in kids. as well as parents. And, that contributes to some of these issues. When you can't cope with things, you sometimes look for things to help you not have to think about them or to help you cope with them. We have sort of societal expectations. We were talking about college a few minutes ago, and but we certainly are seeing this in high schools, in middle schools even, where we're sort of celebrating or emphasizing this fragility for kids. We don't want to do anything that makes them uncomfortable. We don't want to do anything that makes them have to think outside their, move outside their comfort zones. And, that to me is a very dangerous line to walk, because for all these same reasons, you sometimes you have to be uncomfortable to grow.
That's right.
And we're restricting or preventing kids from experiencing that.
Right. That's right. And now we offer trigger warnings, well, in today's class, I'm going to be talking about this. So I want you to know, so if you're sensitive, you can leave the room. Just the opposite of what an education should do. An education should help you to become stronger, more determined, and more resilient. But yet we're taking away the opportunity to do that. Yeah. And then, the last thing is political polarization, this very angry political mood in our country today. What does that do? It creates mutual hatred and less tolerance. Okay. When politicians and news media, there's this extreme negativity and anger against other groups. Well, you're teaching hatred. You're teaching intolerance. People use the word liberal, they spit it out of their mouth. So it's a bitter pill. No, these are just differences of opinion, and so why do we teach? So we're teaching hatred and intolerance, and hatred and intolerance make for a more dangerous and unhappy world. Right.
Yeah. So, but as we look at all of this, I think that our sort of take-home messages. Messages, because there's a number of things to pull out from this, and that is that the first thing, of course, is that not one of these is there's not a single one of these that is the best explanation and sufficient for explaining all of it, all of these changes that we're seeing. It's likely a combination of all of these things and more, other things that we haven't thought about.
That's right. That's the true value of this article, is it finally says there is no single explanation. They're combining in some way, but there's no single explanation to say this is what's causing it.
Yeah, and I think that again, kind of pulling things that we've talked about over the last couple of months, when we see some of these statistics and some of these things that are going on, we have to remember that while, as this author says, as kids seem to be growing up more slowly emotionally, they're growing up faster, sort of externally, like with the information that they have, but they don't know how to manage that information, and they don't know how to cope with some of these distress. And so you end up with kids who know things that maybe are surprising and maybe even impressive, that they know some of this stuff, but they don't really know how that information fits within the social emotional world that they live in. And so then they apply it wrong, or they put themselves into situations where they have various problems that they can't then cope with.
That's right. And then on top of that, you have this news cycle that creates this existential gloom for their parents. So their parents are anxious and nervous. They're frightened that their children are going to be, harmed in some way. And so parents pass that on to children, or they bubble wrap their kids. They want to protect them from all of these possibilities out there. And so they're constantly accommodating and sort of paving the way. Helicopter parents or snowplow or lawnmower parents. They're sort of making the world a safer place for their children, which is, on the one hand, it's good, but on the other hand, robs their children to develop the strength that they need to do it themselves.
Right. Yeah. I think it's both of those things. I think it's that the parents pass on the gloom, the existential gloom of what's happening in the world. And then they reinforce that by putting that bubble wrap and protecting everything. And say, not only is this world unsafe and a danger to you, but it's you. I can't even do anything. You can't do anything about it. So I'm going to wrap you in this protection and make sure that nothing bad ever happens to you, because you can't handle it. And so then kids never learn how, and then that they're, they never have to gain the skill of being resilient.
Right. That's right. And so we talk about the internet. The internet is a wonderful thing, and it gets better and better. I always think about how difficult it was to do research back in the 80s and even in the 90s, that you had to go to libraries, and it was this cumbersome activity. Now you go on the internet and there's just all this stuff to choose from, and it's immediate. There's an article out today, or this weekend, in the news about maybe we should do away with scientific papers because it takes so long. By the time you publish the paper, it's old news. Okay. And so this internet is I think about, can you imagine what Thomas Jefferson could have accomplished if he had the internet? I mean, he did it with a pen. He did it with a quill pen. Okay. Imagine if he had the internet. But as Thompson says in the article, it's also a carnival of negativity.
Right.
Okay. So it really is. As fabulous as the internet is, it can be it can have a very destructive influence, especially on young minds.
Yeah. And the same with social media. There's a lot of benefit. I think that we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of potential benefit to social media, but we have to be very cautious about what it replaces. As we talked about earlier, if you're on social media instead of going out to the movies with your friends, that's a big difference. That's a big problem, because you're losing some of that sociality. You're losing some of those interactions, some of those social skills that you need to be successful and to build that resilience. You're just losing all of that stuff.
Right. So between what the effect that has and the effect of parents protecting you, these kids are growing up without a core strength. Not a physical core, but this emotional core, resilience, and being able to, you have to have opportunity to learn that you can handle stress. I mean, it doesn't come automatically. You have to go through it and know that you can survive it.
Right. Absolutely. So go ahead.
No, that's it. I was thinking that all this made me think of my glacier theory, which is that, it takes one more snowflake. It takes one additional snowflake and the glacier starts to move. And that reminded me of this, because this is an accumulation of factors that parents need to be aware of. It's not a single factor. It's not the cell phone. Parents say, oh, she's addicted. It's not just the cell phone. It's a more complex picture than that. And we have to acknowledge that it's more complex. And we have to provide children with the opportunity to develop strength and resilience. And that comes by stubbing your toe and skinning your knee occasionally. Okay. There was another article in the paper, in the news this weekend, about the Japanese are beginning to raise their children by providing them opportunities to experience stress. They're letting their kids, and there's a preschool. There are preschools in Japan. They just let the kids roam around and discover things not discover academic things, but they expect them to clean the room and to take out the garbage and to empty the waste can. These are kids who are 5 years old, learning how to take care of things. Okay.
Absolutely.
And so there's some new approaches to parenting and teaching coming out of Japan that I'll have to take a closer look at.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we'll keep our eye out for that, and we'll, as we find more, we will share more.
Yep.
All right. Okay. So that's it then for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.